over to Jamie Awalt, our moderator for today's webinar. Jamie?
Thank you, Lisa. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jamie Awalt. I'm the Assistant State Archivist at the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville, Tennessee. And welcome to the CoSA April webinar. We have a really great presentation today from John Chrastka from EveryLibrary, Advocacy Insights from EveryLibrary. So we will have his presentation. There will be time for question and answers, as Lisa said, and you can put those in the chat box and we'll read those out for you. After the question and answer period, Lisa will return and give us some updates on upcoming programs and webinars and things that we can expect along the horizon. So we'll go ahead and get started. So John Chrastka is a founder and executive director of EveryLibrary, the first super PAC for libraries, and the EveryLibrary Institute, a public policy and tax policy think tank for libraries. Since 2012, EveryLibrary has provided pro bono support to 104 library communities with ballot measures and tax referendum, helping win over $325 million in stable tax funding. He's a former board president of the Berwyn, Illinois Public Library, and RAILS, which is the Reaching, that's my Southern coming out, the Reaching Across Illinois Library System. Prior to EveryLibrary, he was a partner in Associate Direct, an association consultancy, and was director for membership development at ALA. He was recognized by Library Journal in 2014 as a mover and shaker. So everyone, welcome John Chrastka, and John, I'll let you take it away.
Jamie, thank you so much, and Barbara and the whole team for the opportunity to hang out with you guys a little bit today and to start thinking through some of the intractables, if you will, that might be happening. I want to share with you some insights that we have here at EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute on how people are wired to think about taxes and to respond as voters and as constituents of elected officials, as volunteers and as donors. And we're faced right now with a very significant challenge, not only from a provision of services and a human to, sort of human supports, both for folks that are out there in the world who need us, but also our own staff and the folks who work in our agencies and in archives, libraries, and even museums around the constituents that we have. We're faced with some really significant challenges, and there's not a whole lot of data about how voters believe right now and how elected officials are behaving right now and how volunteers are reacting and how donors are aligned. And yet there's a lot of background, there's a baseline. There's a baseline about how people think about libraries and archives and museums. There's a baseline about how people listen and talk about taxes and about how support gets built for issues that matter, for organizations that are effective, for causes that people want to be a part of, and for the candidates who become our elected officials. I want to share with you some insights that we have as well a colleague to see whether or not there's some supports that we can provide to you, sure, but also that you can take and perhaps run with. I know that there's a lot of furrowed brows out there about what are we going to do next? How are we going to respond in the crisis? How are we going to position our agencies for the recovery? How are we going to survive in a time of either accidental or enforced austerity, perhaps? All right, so EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute were built with two different organizations. They're separate but related through our mission and our vision and our values. I want to give you just a little bit of background where we're coming from, then take you through the political theory that underpins a lot of our success, and then pivot into some of the issues that you might be facing in terms of positioning your agency and thinking through some of those big challenges. EveryLibrary itself is set up as a 501c4 organization, which means that we are technically, as Jamie said, a super PAC for libraries. If you listen to NPR, you watch Fox News, you hear about super PACs and how they can raise and expend unlimited funds to advance their nefarious special interests. Well, libraries and archives, and to a certain extent museums and the humanities, are our nefarious special interest. Congratulations. We work on one day a year with EveryLibrary as a political action committee. It's election day, it's budget day. It might be the time when a city council or county government or a town board, a state legislature, Congress has to consider putting public money to work for the common good. Or when the voters themselves have to punch a Chad to find out or to acknowledge whether or not they want to fund the common good. The work that we do is all pro bono. When we work with libraries, we are entirely donor supported. We work on all of our, well, the reason we're pro bono, and the reason it's important for me to mention that, is because about half of our funding comes from individual donors, and we've cultivated an individual donor base nationally to help support our organization. About 50% of our funding comes from individual donors. The other half of our funding comes from vendors, corporate partners inside the library world. We're not grant funded at all on the EveryLibrary side because we're a 501c4, we're a political action committee. Our C3, which is the EveryLibrary Institute, which focuses on research and public policy, is our traditional 501c3. It's our traditional nonprofit. It's funded through grants and charitable and philanthropy. So we've got a good mix of both the small donor, large donor, grant writing side of things, and we work on taxes all day long. It's one of the reasons that I'm glad that Barbara brought us in, is because there's a lot of analogous situations here and a lot of the same underpinnings. But on the Institute side, we're set up as a 501c3. It's in order to work on the research framework and the training that's necessary. We have a publishing program, including our journal, The Political Librarian, which works on public policy and tax policy. And we also provide fiscal sponsorships for good ideas in the library's archives and world primarily. Fiscal sponsorship to help small either organizations or ad hoc groups. Like it takes a lot of work to build a 501c3. We've already done it. We might as well help put it to work for small ideas that have big potential impact. Right now, the big thing that we're doing right now that's a little bit off topic for our day-to-day, but there's a lot of things that have changed, of course, during the pandemic, is that we're doing fundraising right now for a program called HALO, which stands for Help a Library Worker Out. And that is intended to be a mutual aid or relief program for library workers who themselves have been laid off or furloughed, have lost wages, or their family member, housemate. When two-income families become one income, it's just as much of a problem. So we're doing fundraising around that right now as well. All right. I want to make sure that we're in a place where you understand that while I'm not an archives professional myself, and we don't do a lot of work on archives specifically, I pay a lot of attention to where state and local money comes from and the challenges for state and local money right now. And I want to put this framework together because each of your different agencies is in a slightly different place inside government. You have slightly different postures in relation to donors. This is a very diverse membership here within a fairly small organization. If there's, 54, 50, 60, there's as many permutations, and yet revenue is going to be really tight really soon. State revenue is off. Sales and use tax is dramatically down. Income tax is being abruptly what's the word I'm looking for? Disturbed. Severance in those states that have oil and gas tax and those kinds of revenue sources, it's a double hit. I mean, lottery's down. I was looking at Iowa just yesterday. The Iowa lottery looks okay on one hand, but there's one line in the lottery. It's a pull tabs game that is only really sold at bars and restaurants, and they're all closed right now. And there's a $300,000 monthly shortfall in the budget. I mean, this is such a dynamic situation. And the ongoing pressures that state government and local government is experiencing, state and local government, who are the primary funders for our agencies as well as for the folks that we care about. There is a lot happening right now in the grant-making side of our sector as well, where most of it's focused on immediate relief and not much is focused yet on continuity of operations. And unless we lead from the inside as the agency partners, and unless we talk with a full voice, these problems are going to roll over us. I know none of us are interested in seeing that happen. Let me talk to you for a few minutes about what we know from working on hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer-funded, voter-facing, and elected official-facing negotiations. This is not everyday advocacy work. This isn't storytelling. This isn't even lobbying necessarily for a particular bill. This is budget that we work on all the time. If you roll up all of our wins over the course of the last couple of years, it's about $1.8 billion in stable tax money for libraries because, well, you put a 20-year levy or a 20-year bond or a 5-year tax measure out there, it does add up. And we have won and lost in red states and in blue states. We've won and lost in places that you wouldn't expect. I want to share with you some of the political literacy skills that we've been building ourselves and trying to share with leaders to see how it fits with your particular agency's advocacy and activism needs. We work with every single campaign that we do on two aspects of it. One is on the staff and the board side, which is publicly funded and is not it's not advocacy. It's communications, because you cannot use public money to influence the outcome of a campaign. We understand that. We respect that. We don't even look to the edges of that. We embrace that. And in fact, I live in Chicagoland. If we had public money going to advance political campaigns, well, we have a long enough history of graft, fraud, and corruption in our communities here. That said, what can the staff do on public time with public money as a public employee? And what does the board do as a public official in order to tell the difference to elected officials and to voters? Again, this is a function of what staff needs to do. What's going to happen if it passes and what's going to happen if it fails? And then, of course, this is an advocacy campaign. It's direct lobbying. We're a super PAC, for goodness sakes. So we go out and we also support the local political process, where there's quite a firewall between those two things. The local political process used to be knocking on doors. Now it's a lot more social media and telephone, and even some direct mail. The local political process is who else cares about this public entity having the right kind of funding? Who's part of the big coalition, the big tent of politics? So I want to be able to share with you some of the things that come in from what you can do on staff time and what other folks might need to do with you and for you. But it all begins with a series of metaphors. When we're working with public libraries, either on the ballot or in a negotiation with a city council, a county government, a state legislature, we use two key metaphors. One is the librarian as candidate, and that makes people terribly uncomfortable. But we also use the metaphor of the library as cause. And that's because, largely speaking, unless you're a user, the answer to the question of where's my money going to go isn't necessarily that you particularly and personally will receive a better experience of the collection or a better access to materials or a better user experience. If you're not a user, in fact, the question of where's my money going to go is purely mission-driven and values-based. So, and the question of who's going to spend my money needs to be answered as well, which is why we use the metaphor of librarian as candidate. Candidates are, well, I'll get into this in just a second, but candidates they need to be seen doing the work that they're doing, whether or not they're particularly serving the individual or representing an ideal. And the library as a cause is used as a metaphor to help organize staff and organize supporters because, again, unless you're doing some sort of a if-then quid pro quo with a particular user, the librarians are seen, well, where's my money going to go? Who do I care about? Who do I care about? And who are the librarians serving? Who do I care about? What are my ideals as a voter, as an elected official, as a constituent of those elected officials? What are my ideals as a donor or a volunteer? And how are the archives professionals, how's the state archives realizing those hopes that I have? Sure, I could potentially use it myself for a particular line of inquiry, for a particular service. And yeah, it might be nice if there was a little bit better budget for that particular service, but overall, overarching, what's my hope for our state? Because you folks have the right kind of funding and staffing to serve the community, to serve your mission, and my shared set of values. It's fascinating when you start talking about the idea of a candidacy because, well, let me get to that in just one second here. What motivates people to support a candidate? This comes from political theory. This is not particularly library specific. In fact, there's very few elements of political theory that are library specific. We're not very political. And yet, if the metaphor is the librarian is candidate because they embody the ideals, then let's talk about how folks think about candidates. The personal value system of the voter. And that personal value system is informed by the indicators that a party provides, oftentimes. That drives decision-making and about what policies should be enacted rather than the policies themselves. The value system of the voter looks at a candidate as the person who puts those sorts of policies to work and embodies that set of ideals and is the person we can get behind. And it's based first and foremost on a shared value system that the voter has with the candidate. It has very little to do with the personal characteristics. In fact, if I had been given a big enough slide, I would have put a really big gap between the shared value system and also the shared identity. And identity politics is at the heart of darkness of American politics, don't get me wrong, but fundamentally it's what collects people together around a set of ideals. It might be more noble than dark, but there's a big, big space between the value system that the candidate espouses and the identity that the party comes together around and the characteristics of any particular candidate. And again, this is political theory, and for every Donald Trump, I will raise you a Bill Clinton. Likewise, the idea of policy consistency does matter to a voter, but it's the fourth of a very deep down fourth. Fundamentally, what people vote for, who people vote for, is driven by, does that candidate, okay, think about the books. Think about the books that these candidates write. And in fact, think about this, if you like the book, you will embrace it to your heart. And you will hand it over to somebody that you love or like or respect and say, hey, you should check this one out. This person, this guy, this gal has got it going on. And if you don't like the book and it offends you, you will throw it across the room. Because that book fundamentally is a transmission of the value system. Yeah, there's policies in it, perhaps. I think about sometimes, and you know, when Jamie was doing my bio earlier, I was on the board for Rails. I was on the board for my local library. We went through 2 strategic planning processes. And I was board president for 6 of those 8 years. I was on the local board here in Berwyn. If we had named our book, our strategic plan what we should have named it, which is essentially, it was our book, you know? This is what we wanted to do in town, in my hometown. We should have named it It Takes a Village, with the Berwyn Public Library at the center. We should have named it Dreams for My Hometown Public Library. We should have named it Make Berwyn Great Again, because that's what was in it. We were talking about shared values, and yet we were also talking about a lot of policy issues. And that's the last thing that people really cared about. How many hours, how many people, how many books, what big of a collection, what's our digitization issues, what's our interlibrary loan issues, what's our broadband connectivity, how are websites out of date? And yet, the value system in that strategic plan that needed funding, the value system about who we wanted to be as a community, taking care of each other in different ways, we should have titled it what it was. Instead, we titled it, I think it was like Vision 2015 and Ahead to 2020, and my apologies to everybody who lives in Berwyn. And yet, in Berwyn, there were a lot of people who support the library, who are part of, if I could say it like this, the library party or the librarian party. They would like to see who is spending the money, not as a user necessarily. In fact, there's a lot of folks in my hometown. There's a lot of folks probably in your friends of the archives space. There's a lot of people who you meet at parties or at receptions who say something to the effect of, what you do is an extraordinary job. Tell me more. Because they've never been in your facility or anybody else's facility, and yet they have an ideal. They have a hope. They have some perception. And they would like to be, well, they sort out in one of 4 ways. Supporters of a campaign and supporters of a candidate. They have, picture concentric circles, please, with relational at the center. Somebody who has a relational type of support to a candidate or a cause has a relational kind of support because they have some personal experience, or it might be a perception. It might be a big rally that they attended. It might be a social media post that they've really attached to. It might be a series of TV commercials that have moved them from simply being an observer into somebody who's got a relationship. And it could be that handshake that was done on a rope line or at a reception. They have some sort of relationship with the candidate or the representative of that cause. Now, is this best? Yeah, it actually is. It takes a lot, though, to move somebody from being unaware of who you are to aware, let alone to be in a relationship with you. And yet, they form the core. There's also another ring, the ideological ring, the next ring out from the center, where there are people who have a value system that agrees with the candidate's value system, who've never met the candidate, don't necessarily need to meet the candidate, don't necessarily need to be identified with the party. They're not a card-carrying member of anything. And yet, they have a value system that sees that the work that's being done by that candidate or within that cause is personally relevant to them without that personal connection. It's personally relevant because, well, in public libraries and in school library land, the relational people are the ones who have literacy as a top 5, definitely a top 10 personal issue. And they have a relationship in some way, shape, or form that's a little bit deeper than simply, well, the ideological folks might not have literacy in their top 10 for public libraries, but they definitely have something to say about the whole life of the child, about the cohesion of a community, about workforce development. They are aligned around the ideals and not just the people. And yet a lot of our marketing is focused on use and not on the ideals. A lot of our marketing is about, and this is in library land, it might be the same way for Archivesville, a lot of our marketing is focused on the noun of the library and not necessarily on the noun of the librarians or library workers who are doing the work. There's 2 other types of political supporters. One is the third type, and again, this is concentric circles, is the aversion supporter. It's somebody who says, well, the enemy of the friend of my friend or the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's pretty much the aversion supporter. They're like, I'm voting against instead of voting for. And there is a certain number of people in this country who are interested in supporting institutions that might be aligned towards a particular ideal or away from a particular ideal, and who are going to be supportive in moments of strong calls to action. I'll get to that in a few minutes, though, about the marketing of those people. There's not a lot of aversioning going on, except maybe around the idea of we don't like illiteracy in libraries. And then the fourth ring is the access supporters. There are very, very few of these in library land or in maybe in archives land, maybe museums land or in humanities or in the arts you see more of it, but definitely in politics. It's the people who want access to the candidate or the leadership, so they'll do a $500 a plate dinner or a $10,000 a plate dinner so they can have their picture taken with. That's a whole... If you folks know a lot of those people, introduce them to me. I think in library land or in libraries, archives, and museums, I'd like to meet them because we need more of them, quite honestly. All right. Another piece of our political theory that underpins our work as a political action committee for libraries is that use of the library does not matter at all, does not matter one bit, doesn't matter for naught in somebody's interest in supporting the library on election day or not. And this is a fascinating finding. It's not our finding. It comes from OCLC, our dear friends at OCLC, and the From Awareness to Funding study they did back in 2008. And it was confirmed again in the 2018 data. And my apologies to the OCLC people in the room. I should have put a little footnote on here about where this came from. That said, library use doesn't matter. There are people who have not darkened the door of a library since they were children, and they're going to vote for you. There are people whose family is too wealthy to use the place, and they're going to donate to it. There are people who are in the library, back when we could do that, when that was still allowable, they were in the library every day, and they were never going to vote for you because what they were doing when they were in the library is writing their manifesto about how government is going to get us. They are not ideologically aligned around taxes, and yet they're in there every day. Or they don't actually have a political voice themselves. The user status of that voter or that constituent. We have this problem in library advocacy where we say if they'd only come into my facility and see the place, then they would support us. They won't. They're going to just drive by, see the parking lot's full, and think everything's fine. Which means that if the value proposition around bringing in new money to the organization, the institution, the agency, is that you personally will get something good from this new money, most people don't care. In fact, there's a whole disconnection in library land, and I'm not sure exactly how it works totally in archives. I'd like to figure this out with you folks. But there's a disconnect between what people value a public library doing, which is largely around things like helping people bridge the digital divide and a safe place and a place of discovery, when if they're a user, their own use is literally they just want to read some fun books. There's a disconnect around that nobility of what they think the librarian as the candidate is doing and what their own personal use is if they happen to be a user. They're fine. Like, honestly, personally, I don't need any help bridging the digital divide. Me, John, hi, nice to talk to you folks today. I don't need any help doing that. I can bridge the digital divide on the devices that my stay-at-home children have lost or broken. And yet I think about, well, there but for the grace of God go I. The equity issues in education right now, the equity issues around access to information, the equity issues around transparency, about government. I'm pretty savvy personally. I know that what you folks do is something that's really powerful. But you have to remind me that you're doing it from time to time, because otherwise I'll just drive by, see the parking lot's, well, empty right now, and I'm pretty sure you're all working from home, and what's going on? And yet my value system says that there should be somebody like you, an agency like yours, doing the transformational work for the public and the transparency work for government and the enduring work of reminding us of who we are and helping us discover it again. There's 4 stories that we try and encourage folks to tell, and they're not stories. They're not about Johnny learning how to read, or Sam finding a job, or Karen doing intergenerational transfer of cooking skills to and family recipes to her kid. These are stories of what we found what we find all the time in library advocacy, and this might be true for archives as well. And I said this earlier, we use the wrong nouns. We use the wrong pronouns. Heck, we use the wrong verbs. We only have one verb in libraries, it's read. We need to diversify our verbs. We tend to use the word library as if it's a noun and a pronoun. We need to be able to tell stories. If we're the candidate for new funding, and if we're leading a cause, I did this and we need that, are a vocabulary lesson that we have to take to heart, because it wasn't the library or the archive or the museum or the art center that did it. It's the staff. It's us coming together. I did this, we need that. And the other noun problem inside library advocacy is library, and then it should also be a librarian or library worker. We have some awkwardness in our vocabulary around advocacy that doesn't activate belief systems. It doesn't appeal to the ideals, and it keeps people in a certain remove from either having a relationship with us or identifying us as an ideological partner in the way the world should be. There are 4 stories to tell, and the first one is not about Johnny learning how to read inside library land. It's stories of our success that demonstrate our competency, because why are you going to fund something that isn't competent? Why are you going to fund people who are not competent at what they're doing? And the only people who are going to tell the story of our own success is us. Likewise, there are stories, especially in a time like this, of failure that demonstrate our integrity. Our integrity both to name failure, because it takes courage to do that, and people who are in a position to fund an agency, to be a donor, to be a grant partner, to be a legislator, are interested in outcomes through competency and integrity. What has been exposed in the pandemic about shortfalls and inequities needs to be named by your agency in the ways that you can properly fix it, even if you have, well, not necessarily been able to do it properly before because you didn't have the right money or the right staffing comportment or the right technology. It's extremely important to talk to we know this to be true, to tell the truth. Yes, you might have more competencies than integrities to stand on, more successes than failures, or vice versa, but your funding partners see through it if you're trying to blow smoke. The impact on community or people that your funders care about, and funders here could be voters, elected officials, donors, whatever. That's the third story. That's the Johnny can read story. The first two are about us and we and I and the agency. And then the fourth one is extremely important because it has nothing to do with use. The stories that we tell that demonstrate shared values are all about what we did yesterday and not coming to a program or availing yourself personally of a resource or participating in some way. It's what did we do yesterday when somebody availed themselves of a resource or participated in a program. We fulfilled some sort of shared value system. And the people who have that similar value to what you're doing for a living will resonate with that, and we have to tell that. Also, not all of these stories are stories. They're not all narratives. There's a whole category of advocacy training that keeps telling us that we need to do storytelling only and to avoid statistics, and I disagree fundamentally, especially in a pandemic. There's a whole group of policymakers that we know to be in the negotiations that we're engaged in. There's a whole group of policymakers who are very interested in the sports page. They're the folks who, well, I'm going to talk about my father-in-law for just a second because he's the best example in the world of this. Ed, my father-in-law, we don't have a whole lot in common, me and my father-in-law. The only thing that we really have in common is a shared love for his daughter and his grandkids. Ed is a sports guy. He's in the National Softball Hall of Fame as an umpire. He was a player, but then he's called balls and strikes for 35 years. He watches ESPN. I don't know how many there are. He's in deep mourning right now during the shutdown because there's no sports to watch live. He watches ESPN until 2 in the morning, then goes to the grocery store, the gas station to pick up a copy of the Chicago Sun-Times. He opens up to the sports page. He reads the box scores first, even though he's up watching the games. And then what he does is he turns the page. And he turns the page and reads about the team, how the team came together to overcome adversity, how the team came together to extend their streak or to fight the slump, how the star player really shone, how the coach did what the coach does, and the GM and the decisions, and the narrative storytelling around what he cares about has its frame around the stats. And to demonstrate competency and to talk about failure means that you also have to name the work that you have done and be able in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a full-fledged evidence-based kind of planning or if it's the kind of planning that might be more anecdotal, to be able to say to folks, here are the stats. If you believe in stats, that's fantastic. Now let me tell you about the team here at our agency. Let me tell you about the team. Let me tell you about our star player. Let me tell you about the slump that we're looking to avoid for our communities and for our state. Let me tell you about the streak that we're on that brings people together in a way that's really extraordinary, and the fact that the archival work that we do matters. There's a lens of statistics that you should be very conscious about surfacing. All right, let me pivot for a moment about, essential. That was political theory, all right? Political theory is fascinating. I want to start getting into some more of the specifics, but again, I don't know you personally, and I don't know your agency extremely well, so I need to keep this at about 40,000 feet. And yet what's underpinning a lot of our conversations right now in this country, in your state, at the Capitol, are around who's essential. But there's two parts to essential in the pandemic about who's working and what's open and how are they open and how are they interfacing. There's the essential question around when, and there's the question of the essentiality about why. And a lot of air has left the room right now around why, because it has to for archives and libraries and the humanities, because it's going over to the medical side and the public health side. And yet you and your agency, you and whether you're part of a state library or a state historical society or you stand alone, the work that you're doing is fundamentally essential. And I don't know if enough people know about it, who are policymakers, legislators, the public, constituents, donors, potential volunteers in the future, grant partners. Let's talk about this just for a minute. I want to hopefully we can apply some of this political theory to your marketing and your positioning around this during the shutdown and during the recovery. And our position here at EveryLibrary is fundamentally one that says, I would like us, meaning EveryLibrary as an organization, to be remembered for what we were trying to do rather than forgotten because we did not actually do anything. So I have a certain bias in bringing these couple of slides forward. But I also want to see you guys be properly funded today and moving forward because I value the work that you're doing, even though I'm not in archive land myself. During the shutdown, what defines essential? I think this is me as somebody who's not inside the space, but looking at you from kind of the outside. And if I'm going to try and be an advocate for you, because you tell me what you need, I'm going to try and stand with you as a policy partner. The real-time collection of government actions that archives do is absolutely essential during the shutdown because there's a whole group of folks out there right now who are concerned about honesty, who need transparency, and want the long tail of documentation in order to write not only their own history, but the history of what's happening to your state, in government. The accountability that you provide as part of the background radiation of archives right now needs to be emphasized in a very significant way. Likewise, some of you right now in my cursory survey heading into this webinar today, the 30th of April, I'm really impressed about the real-time facilitation of individual, family, and population experiences that you're doing around the pandemic. And if you're not, I would highly recommend that you start that. And if you're doing it solo as an agency and you're not working with libraries and archives around and museums around the state to do it, or if you're hoping that somebody's going to follow, I would suggest that there's a lot of currently under-busied workers out there in library land who would love to be able to partner with their state archives on helping people collect their experience of going through the pandemic, going through the shutdown, of their own family stories, their neighborhood stories, their community stories, their population stories. Also, as a parent right now, yeah, it's my experience of having to go to my state school board here in Illinois and find out what the social studies requirements are because my own kid in 5th grade, they're not really doing it in his packet right now. And I run a political action committee for libraries, so I'm particularly interested in social studies. And yet the shortfalls in educational resources that I know that your agency is helping to address that may or may not be seen right now. Yeah, I could use it as a parent. I have a value system as well that says we should be teaching not just to the test, but to who we are as a community, as a state, as a nation. And you guys have got the good stuff. And you got the good stuff in a way that even if I don't have kids, and there's nothing noble about this, I just would like to maybe finally get around to my family genealogy project during the shutdown. Maybe get around to learning a little bit more about that place I visited that I've never done any real research on, or that place I'm anticipating going, or that identity that I heard about when I was a kid, but I never really explored. Folks, you make life more interesting right now during the shutdown. And I want more of these stories to be told because it activates believers, those folks who've got a relationship. It activates those people who are ideologically aligned. It's stories of very competent work that should continue. We shouldn't let this have a hiccup or a stumble. Or if there are populations and people and communities that have not had full success with this, I want to see a competent agency that has integrity do it instead of seeing failure continue. And it's not me as a user, though with one of these I might actually want to do it, but not all of them, but I believe it. And it's not just progressives, it's conservatives and it's libertarians. And then in the recovery, Let's talk about this for just another moment more. In the recovery, how is your agency and the archives that you will, in a certain respect, represent? Even though you don't, I know that, that's cool, but you're kind of the flagship. You know, you're the National Archives for your state. And I'm a civilian saying that. But let's talk about how we can position you potentially for fundability in the recovery based on the work that you do that puts a value system to work and is mission aligned with many different people. In the economic stimulus, I would love to see the archives facilities be a component of whatever shovel-ready stimulus bill that they're going to produce at some point or another, and they being Congress, and they being people that you can get to potentially, because what a stimulus bill wants to do is put people back to work, and what puts people back to work is construction. What puts people back to work is asphalt and fiber optic cable and retrofitting buildings, perhaps for an HVAC and humidity control system that you've never had before. It could be about digitization, absolutely, of the collection, but it could actually be about the facilities as well. It could be about the fiber to the archive. And the only people who can identify your shovel-ready projects for your agency, as well as around the state, are all y'all on this call. I would love to see, personally, based on a value system in the recovery, more of these educational shortfalls being addressed, and your position around equity of access to collections is a moral leadership as well as a tactical tactical deliverable. Community cohesion is going to be in severe straits. People are fundamentally and physically disconnected from each other. We are social animals. And there are certain communities that are being harmed more than others in this from the virus, but also in this from the economics. The isolation that you can help ameliorate, not only with access to your collection, but access to the idea that you are preserving, protecting, defending, and extending our image of self. There are people who are going to want to see the state archive and the archives and the museums and the history collections, the libraries, amplified because of that mission-driven. And yet you are the only ones. As the candidate, my apologies. As the leader of the cause, my apologies. You're the only ones who can define that, because most people, well, you know, they used to drive by and see the parking lots full and think, isn't that nice? I'm glad that that's happening. Continuity and discovery as well. In the recovery, transparency and discovery of what happened. Yes, some of it's recording the individual's experience. A lot of it is going to be about, did we do this in an open, transparent, consultative, and ethical way? All right. We talk about marketing, because that's essentially what helps make a budget secure moving forward. Positioning is a euphemism for marketing, and I want to focus on your agency and also on your workforce, because it's not just where's the money going to go, it's the who's going to spend the money. Marketing about what you're doing right now. And we need to start, if you're not already doing it, and if you're not getting good results on the marketing that you're doing through social media, through Google Ads, and through some of that word of mouth marketing amongst policymakers, I'd be very happy to chat. We're pretty good at this. But to define or redefine your agency and define what archives are around your state and who archives professionals are right now needs to be a component of the marketing that you're doing. And when we remember, if we could, the types of supporters who are out there for any political issue. Well, let me get to the next slide. There are three kinds of supporters. I'm not going to worry about the access people, but relational supporters, the ones who have some sort of strong identification with archives, with archivists, with archives professionals, with librarians, with researchers. You know, those types of job titles where they have a strong relational support, they're thrilled. They're thrilled. We don't have to educate them at all. You're fulfilling a mission and realizing a shared set of values. Now, for those people, your marketing needs to tell them what you need next. Perhaps it's to support you in the legislature. Perhaps it's to support you as a donor or a volunteer, a networker or a connector. Then there's a whole bunch of ideological supporters who are interested in learning more because you're mission aligned. And to go back to those things that you can do during the crisis and in the recovery, that's where your missions are aligned. And then the marketing about what you're doing right now, what you did already, to those people who are potentially aversionally supporting you because they don't like where we're going as a country, as a state, as a people, and you're doing something that is, well, better than the rest. They need to hear the truth from you about what happens if you don't do the work. The aversion supporters are the ones who, if you were to say to them, we don't want the library to, or we don't want the archives to close or to be diminished or shut down or experience any sort of interruption because, yeah, relational people are like, no, don't, we will defend our archivists forever. But it's the aversion supporters, not the ideological ones, who come out in a crisis because they're not going to use the place. They don't really particularly know any of you, but they want to see something go, if I can say it this way, right instead of wrong. And you're one of the rights in this world. All right. The question of who's going to pay for marketing, you have to figure that out. My apologies. I can help you figure that out a little bit on a one-on-one call, but you're going to have to find the money. Because without marketing dollars behind your mission, vision, and values, what you did yesterday and what you're going to do tomorrow, that's not just for somebody to utilize it themselves, but for somebody to understand that you're realizing a set of values around who we should be and how we should behave. I'd like to help you find the money to do it, because without that, I'm nervous. I'm nervous that we will not be seen as the candidate that we are, or the cause that is so necessary to be properly funded. Marketing is not going to save you alone on Facebook or on Google AdWords or whatever. There's a lot of marketing here in terms of talking to the decision makers directly as well. Outreach, that's another word for it. As a political action committee executive director, I can also say lobbying, though I'm not going to say that to you folks because it's not really in the zone of your work. I get it. Let's go back to marketing. All right. Let's also talk for a moment, if we could, about donors and grant makers. There's a lot of noise in the marketplace right now. I've seen it amongst fundraisers in the library space, the museum space, the humanities space, the arts space. Should we be fundraising right now? And the answer is yes. And should we be applying for grants? Should we be talking to our grant makers? The answer is yes. And not to supplant what should be paid for by the taxpayers, but to supplement and to extend. There might be a period here where soft money is what carries, and I don't want it to be the case, but the soft money also might be what you need to experiment in the recovery, to put your value system, your mission, your expertise as archives professionals to work. Major donors, they're wondering what to do right now, and they will fund where the ask comes from. They're worried that their money is going to be wasted. They're uncertain about the path forward. This isn't me making this up. This is Chronicle Philanthropy. They're looking for organizations that are stressed as well. When I say major donors, I'm talking about major donors, capital M, not a $4,000 donor. This is somebody who can actually put some money to work for you. They're looking for organizations that are stressed in order to support those organizations during hard times, and they don't know that you're stressed unless you tell them. And do not assume because a Tia Kraft portfolio might be a little shaky right now that they won't be able to make a gift. They will be able to make a gift. If they are able to make a gift, they will do it. If they're not, they'll tell you they can't. But I would encourage you not to open with an ask. I would instead encourage you to talk about what your continuity plan is, if it's funded, and if it's not. Yes, your work is continuing. It's changed in the short term. In the long term, there's going to be a new normal, and we're going to need your help then. And to invite a conversation with your donors that asks if you can share what's happening right now. If they say no, that's all right. That's not an offensive thing. It's that we're all sitting in one place a lot, but we're all moving targets right now. But if they say yes to the invitation, may I share with you? what we're facing as an agency, where we need to go, what we've identified as the shortfalls, what we've identified as our successes and our strengths. You can have a very successful conversation, even with small donors. This is a very stressful time, but we're in like week 3 right now here at EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute of raising money for that Halo Fund. Our average personal donation to the Help a Library Worker Out Fund is $70.05. We've raised $30,000 in $70 increments, and we're paying it out to individuals in $200 to $250 grants for personal expenses, and the folks who can donate are donating. And the reason that we're asking them, and it's all through email and social media, why are we doing this? Not what we're doing. Why are we focusing on the library worker right now, the librarians, the people in most need, as opposed to why were we focusing on institutions? Well, we'll go back to that, focus on institutions, but the why of what we're doing right now. Donors want to support, volunteers want to show up. However, with any conversation that you're going to have as a leader, you have to remember for a moment that they're going to start to talk about their own experience before they're going to ask you about your experience. And that's just the burden of leadership. My apologies moving forward. Grantmakers, too. If you are in a position right now where you are feeling restricted by grants, this is the time. Again, this is coming from Chronicle of Philanthropy. This is not us. For you to talk to your grant makers about liberalizing, if you will. And to talk to new potential grant makers, not philanthropy, not major individual donors or corporate donors, but grant makers about the emergency funds and the rapid response funds that they have. Corporate partners who want to see smart money go to something that's measurable and effective. Anchor institutions like yours should be more attractive right now. And institutional grant makers who need to hear from you about the mission-aligned work that you're anticipating doing, especially a couple weeks from now, a couple months from now, and certainly over the next few years. And don't be shy about talking about your staffing needs and your overhead at this point. All of the old rules are not out the window, don't get me wrong, and all the old biases are not suddenly, everybody's not just holding hands and singing, songs together. But to be frank about what staff means, as well as technology, as well as facilities, as well as overhead, to talk about the role that the I and the we have in realizing the vision and the mission and the value system, it's very important to be able to do that right now. And it distinguishes you from, potentially other funding or funded entities, because you have, the only experts in your community, in your state, in your place, who know what they're talking about this particular topic. And without those staffers, the grant maker doesn't see their programmatic priorities go to a good end. All right, coming around the horn, I want to remind you, if you want to put some things in the chat, we'll have that chat time coming up. Coalition work around this as well. I am nervous on the library side. I don't know if I need to be on on the archive side, but I'm going to bring it up because I'm nervous on the library side that we're not in enough coalitions right now. Both as state library organizations, a lot of our state library partners are cool as far as I can tell, but at the same time, a lot of local libraries are not, and I'm nervous. Who else cares about addressing the big problems in society over the long term, where if they're looking at you as simply somebody who's providing a service as opposed to an anchor institution or an established agency, I think you have a lot to bring to coalitions, both in the short term around equity and education, around transparency, around inclusion, as well as over the long term. And I'd highly recommend assigning staff at this point to be able to do that. There are state agency task forces that are going to need your perspective at the table. There are state and regional coalitions that are focused on populations that are currently in crisis or at the margins or about to fail, and that there are state level and regional level coalitions focused on the place that you call home. Business development and employment is going to be massive. And again, this is about participation in those task forces and coalitions and not just service. A lot of times my library colleagues will show up and say, I've got a resource for you. That's nice. Thanks for the resource. Instead of saying, I have an anchor institution that's built out to be able to deliver common services, common mission. All right. I just gave you like 50 minutes of if I was yous. Like I said before, Berwyn, Illinois, we're a suburb of Chicago. I was on the board here for a long time, Rails, but I can see the Sears Tower. It's always going to be the Sears Tower, by the way. Essentially, if I stick my head out my home office window, okay, just look east a little bit. So in Chicago, we give advice in two ways. We say, if I was you and I got a guy, okay? I just gave you an hour almost of if I was you. If I was you, I would do X. If I was you, I'd do Y. Thank you for listening. I appreciate the invitation to do that. I hope that we're mission enough aligned ourselves, though, that if you need a guy, in Chicago, it's like, oh, your radiator's broken, I got a guy. And, you plumber, I got a guy. If you can consider EveryLibrary one of those, I got a guys, too. We do all of our work around libraries and archives and museums and the humanities and the arts. The big issues facing the American public in as small of an area as one zip code, or as big as of an area as from sea to shining sea. We do it all pro bono. We do it in coalition. We're very much about supporting the legitimate local, however you define local, voice, the legitimate local stakeholder, the legitimate local funding request. I don't set the policy agenda for a library when we come in and help them go to the ballot any more than I would say, well, tell me about your budget. Let's talk about your values. Let me help you amplify what you want to get done. Here's my contact info, easy to get to, everylibrary.org, everylibraryinstitute.org. We're online at EveryLibrary across almost all of our platforms, or all the platforms that are out there. We are here to help think this through, if it would be beneficial or not. And I'd like to start, if I could, with the thinking through. Comments, questions, concerns. I know I dropped a lot on you. Jamie, Barbara, what are we thinking about?
Thank you, John.
My pleasure.
That was a lot. It was great. I like that you got a guy. I need a guy. I think we all need a guy.
Well,
so thank you.
It's kind of fun.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to give it just a quick second for any questions that anyone may have. If you would put those in the chat. And while we're waiting on that, I suppose, I'll start off with one.
Sure.
So, John, if we could do one thing right now to position our agency in the next few months, what would that be?
Values-based marketing, as opposed to getting somebody to use your service, some sort of a version of the annual report that you do every day that says, here's why we put a small amount of smart money to work, helping our state, our constituents succeed in different ways. And there's several different ways: education, economic development, identity. To put some values-based marketing to work right now, I got to tell you, Jamie, that's the biggest thing that could be done. Not necessarily having more numbers involved in what you're doing, more uses, but it's to report on why, as a competent agency with real integrity, how you're putting that small amount of money to work in a smart and effective way.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. Does anyone have any questions? Here's one here.
Yes.
Much of the marketing that you're talking about is based on the public, but how do you tailor that marketing when it needs to be done within the upper levels of your agency's management? That's a great question. That
is a fantastic question. The marketing within the organization. So forgive me, I don't know about your plan of service or your strategic plan or your like budget evaluation process, but rooting it in is two ways. There's a positive way and there's a negative way. The positive way, of course, is rooting your outputs and the reasons why in the strategic plan, the plan of service, and having the invitation for upper management to agree with you that that has been accomplished. And you have to invite the upper management, your bosses, your funders, your top level funders to validate that. And so part of the marketing is asking them to do something, and doing something in this case is validating or agreeing. The negative way is that you sometimes have to bargain with management. And I don't mean negative in like this is bad. It's just that there's a positive aspect to it or affect to it, and there's a negative affect to it. The negative affect to it is essentially you have to bargain. If they're saying no to you, it's because there is a disconnect between what the stated values are and what the actual values are. And the stated values within your agency, I'm sure, are pretty noble. Why are you not being properly funded when the stated values are X, Y, and Z, and you're programmatically aligned on X, Y, and Z? And to have them bargain it with you, that's a particular. The negative strategy is a little bit harder than the positive strategy. I'd love to talk some more about that with you.
Great, wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
See if there's anything. I think that's about it. John, I really thank you for your presentation today, and I think you've brought up a lot of really great things for us to think about. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Everyone give John a virtual round of applause. And definitely keeping your contact information on hand.
Yeah, and like I said before, Jamie, and Barbara knows this already, and I appreciate the committee, the advocacy committee, for wanting me to come in and talk about this. I'm not saying do X, do Y for archives. I'm talking about where we're coming from, but to be able to think it through in terms of a mission-aligned organization, I think we can have some fun. That's why I'm here.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And so, Lisa, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. John, thank you for a wonderful presentation. One of the beautiful things we have with the member webinars is we get great topics, and this year the theme is hot topics, so we're kind of all over the place. So here's the next 3 that are coming up. So if you haven't registered for them, we'd recommend you go ahead and get yourself set up, because I think you're going to enjoy all of them. Also, our SARI webinars. This is the next one coming up in May. Again, check those out. We don't have a slide for it, but of course we have our quarterly CoSA NARA webinars. The next one is probably going to be in June. We don't have all the details yet, but that'll be coming. Watch for that. Of course, none of this is possible without all of the support of our sponsors and funders. And so here's our shout out to them. We, of course, want to stay connected with you, so please use all of our different channels of ways to reach out and literally touch each other, to quote an old advertising campaign. But do stay in touch, particularly in these virtual times. And, of course, as always, we appreciate your feedback, and the Education Committee really does need your evaluations on the webinar, because that really helps us make the plans and prepare the entire program for you so that it's worth your time. Now virtually you've got a little more time possibly, but in your regular day, make sure that you say, yes, this isn't important enough that I want to make time for it once a month to attend these webinars. So again, thank you all for joining us today. John, thank you very much for a wonderful webinar. Stay well, everyone, and we'll catch you at the next webinar. So you guys take care, have a great day, and stay well.